Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Meredith Warren. And today we're going to be discussing Judeophobia and the New Testament. I'll have the affiliate link in the description below to go get the book, and also in the pinned comment just below the description of the video. So thank you for joining me today, Meredith.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on once again. I'd like to start off with so when you look at Judeophobia in the New Testament, is it basically, in a sense, looking at how innuendos of anti-Semitism is going on in there, or things looking like anti-Semitism, or things that have been taken to inspire anti-Semitism within the rhetoric of the New Testament?
Yeah, so it's looking at the ways that these texts and their afterlives have inspired or resulted in or been used or exploited to promote sort of an anti-Jewish attitude, anti-Jewish theology, all the way up to sort of anti-Jewish violence and genocide and things like that. So really looking at each book of the New Testament, some non-canonical stuff, and seeing which sort of phrases stand out as being the most used or the most exploited in that way. And then some meta conversations about the way that New Testament studies as a field, biblical studies as a field, has sort of fallen into these anti-Jewish traps from time to time.
How is the term Pharisee defined?
Yeah, so Pharisee is one of the sections that I edited the book with Eric Van den Eykel and Sarah Rollins, but I also contributed the chapter on Pharisees with Shanna Scheinfeld and Sarah Parks. We've written together on another book that has been on your show. So we wrote on the Pharisees here. The Pharisees, I mean, it's one of these terms that has sort of developed into a life of its own. So the Pharisees, the biblical Pharisees, are quite different from the kind of definition that you get in sort of common parlance. So we actually start out the chapter discussing these sort of two related definitions. So, the Pharisees were this ancient Jewish group. We know a little bit about their ideas and their theologies from sources like Josephus. A little bit of New Testament gives us information, but there's also this other definition of Pharisees, and it gets kind of thrown around as an insult, especially among Christians calling each other Pharisees, and it's sort of associated with being sort of hypocritical or self-righteous or overly legalistic. And in those contexts, it's anti-Jewish in that it is, it's basically calling out, it's a way for Christians to call each other out on being what people perceive as too Jewish in some sense. So it's a way of, it uses this idea of Jews as being other, as an outside group, as sort of antagonistic to Christianity. And that's how Pharisee tends to be used as a slur.
Why does John's Gospel use the term Pharisee interchangeably with its signature phrase, the Jews?
Yeah, the Jews. So the Jews in the Gospel of John, that's a really fraught topic. We actually have a whole chapter on the Gospel of John, of course, because how could you not? But I mean, the way that the Gospels use Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, and then in the Gospel of John, sort of Jews interchangeably, speaks to the way that the New Testament, as sort of time goes on, sort of flattens these the diversity of early Judaism, and sort of works towards or is used to create a very clear division between the followers of Jesus on the one hand and what the Gospel of John calls the Jews on the other hand. And so that flattening kind of is the beginning of how Judaism is constructed by Christian writers as like monolithic and oppositional to early Christianity. And so Adele Reinhartz is actually, and she's done our chapter on the Gospel of John, has written a lot about how the term the Jews gets used in the Gospel of John. And she's argued that it actually is consciously trying to create that really hard line division between John's group, of Jesus followers and this other completely wrong group, right? So that's how the Pharisees kind of gets tied in there as being that stand-in for an entire constructed monolithic group that's wrong.
Is there an attempt to disassociate the Jews from both Paul and Jesus alike? And does the Gospel of John create a rhetorical wedge between Jesus and Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely what's going on there. We reference Adele Reinhardt's work, Cast Out of the Covenant, in our introduction when we discuss this, and in the Pharisees chapter as well, that this is a rhetorical technique. And this is why there's a couple of layers of what's going on when people use the word Pharisee in this way, or when they sort of um, don't read the Gospel's depiction of the Pharisees critically enough, right? Because on the one hand, we have the historical Pharisees, and whether or not the Gospels accurately reflect the historical Pharisees, like I don't think they really do. I think they're doing something rhetorical, but people read the Gospels as if they're reflecting the historical reality of what the Pharisees actually believe, right? And so if we miss that sort of rhetorical force, we actually completely misunderstand, first of all, what's going on in that text, and second of all, what the historical reality might have been, right? And so yes, the gospel writers are really forcefully trying to present Jesus as notable, right? Someone that you want to go and follow, someone whose message you want to listen to. But as many scholars have written, when you have to be the most rhetorically forceful about setting up that kind of boundary and division is often when the two elements are actually most closely related, right? So there's actually more that Jesus and the Pharisees have in common with each other historically than they do, those distinctions, right? And if anything, Jesus is presented as sort of more hard line than the Pharisees, whereas in sort of popular understanding of Pharisees, the Pharisees are presented as sort of overly legalistic, overly concerned with the Torah, overly concerned with, adhering to these sort of black and white understandings of right behavior and wrong behavior. In fact, if you read critically, it's Jesus who says, no, Pharisees, you're not actually going far enough, right? With Paul, things are a little bit more complicated because, and we have a whole section, in addition to a chapter on each of Paul's letters, we also have sort of an overview of like how Pauline studies as a whole has dealt with the issue of anti-Judaism or run with it in some cases. But Paul himself, says he's a Pharisee and positions himself in that context. But his rhetorical aim is slightly different than what the gospel writers are doing, right? So we have quite a bit of complexity going on with each of these, and that's why, as a volume, we're trying to separate out those issues and allow people to view the text, first of all, in their historical context, but then in their rhetorical context as well throughout the historical ages.
Is the term Pharisee across all four Gospels and other places in the New Testament, is it generally, or at least very often, used as an insult?
I don't think it's used as an insult in most cases. I think it's often used descriptively. But I think that the way that the Pharisees are characterized is done with a rhetorical aim of disparaging them. So I don't think the term Pharisee is really first and foremost a slur in the gospel writings, but it's certainly not used to describe a group that the gospel writers want you to like go and hang out with, right? And so it's they get lumped in with the scribes and the Sadducees, and all of those groups are rhetorically described as the sort of the enemies of Jesus's message, right? They're opposed to it. In some circumstances, they are actively conspiring against Jesus, and and they make themselves, they're sort of made into a foil, a very convenient foil for all of Jesus's ideas.
Can you tell us about the man with the withered hand?
Yeah, the man with the withered hand. So that is, I mean, when we talk about that in the book, this is one of these things where it's one of these healing narratives, and it's one of these points in the Gospels where Jesus is sort of challenged by the Pharisees and then also challenges them, right? And so this is, uh, a point where there's an issue with healing on the Sabbath, and the question of whether or not it's appropriate for Jesus to do so. This is an example of how a misunderstanding of early Judaism makes people miss the entire point of this story. The issue is not whether the Sabbath is important or not, right? Jesus is not saying we should not be respecting the Sabbath or observing the Sabbath. This is part of a conversation that expands way beyond the New Testament. This is something that happens in rabbinical texts. This is something that's happening among the Pharisees, right? This is, what is it that we should do to observe the Sabbath, and what kind of activities are allowed to do and what kinds of activities are not allowed to do. And there's a lot of variation in antiquity about that debate, right? And so this is an example of, when this gets read, this is often read as, well, Jesus thinks it's more important to heal than to observe the Sabbath. Okay, fine. But it's presented as, and therefore the Pharisees don't care about people and don't care about healing people. Now, it's really interesting, right, that this is a scenario where the person's illness is not an emergency, right? This is not a situation of life and death, right? If the person with the withered hand were to wait until the next day or even until sunset, probably no difference would be made, right? And so this is not a matter of the Pharisees not thinking this man should be healed, right? This isn't some callous disregard for people's well-being or health or anything like that. We have a lot of evidence of, early Jewish focus on support for the sick and the poor, right? Which is also something that the early Jesus movement cares about. Rather, it's a particular sort of insider debate about what kinds of things are appropriate to do on the Sabbath. And Jesus comes down in this story on one side and the Pharisees on the other. But it's really only the matter of a couple of hours, right? Like, this isn't a life or death thing. If someone had been actually dying, then the Pharisees would also be saying, no, the person's life comes first before the Sabbath. So it's actually a really interesting case that kind of gets misread because it's not looked at in the context of the wider early Jewish debate about Sabbath observance.
How is Pharisee used in contemporary politics?
Yeah, I mean, it gets thrown around a lot. People have been called out on this quite a few times. But, we've got lots of examples of politicians calling each other Pharisees when they don't like what someone else is saying. Often it's used just as sort of a synonym for hypocrite. And so, if a politician calls someone else a Pharisee, they really mean that they're a hypocrite. They don't actually believe what they say, or they're saying one thing that everyone else should do and they're doing something else themselves. So that's kind of how it gets used. I think there's a couple of examples that we talk about in the chapter. Jeremy Corbyn, a British politician, and Pete Buttigieg. I don't know actually how to pronounce his name because I'm Canadian and I don't have to worry about these things as much anyway. But for president, Democratic, contender for president a couple of years ago, he also threw that phrase around at his opponent. So, these things come up every once in a while. There's a bunch of other examples, but, calling people a Pharisee is basically shorthand for calling them a hypocrite.
How do the how do the evangelicals utilize the term Pharisee?
Well, Pharisee, I mean, this is goes back to sort of thinking about Pharisees, and the sort of this uncritical reading of New Testament texts, where Pharisees are, the gospel's presentation, this rhetorically charged presentation of the Pharisees, is taken at face value. And so in Christian contexts, and I'll say I don't think this is necessarily limited to evangelicals. This gets thrown around in lots of different denominations, but it tends to be a way of calling out people for focusing on whatever the speaker thinks is the wrong thing to focus on. Okay, so it's a way of calling out perceived legalism. Okay, which that's a moving target, right? Whatever the speaker thinks of as too legalistic, that's in the eye of the beholder, and it changes depending on who you're talking to and who is actually making the accusation. So it's quite a slippery one, actually. And the use of Pharisee as an insult that way is really interesting, because it's so it really fits a variety of insulting ways to talk to people. But focusing too much on something that's, there's part of what's going on here is this perception that there's something wrong with Judaism, and the wrong thing about Judaism is that it has this it's perceived to have this obsession with the law, right? And we have a really great chapter by Shana Scheinfeld in the book on the law and the way that it is misunderstood. And so there's a kind of a Protestant way of thinking about Christianity is sort of vibes. Christianity's vibes. If you have a good feeling about what you're doing, it's probably what Jesus would have wanted you to do, right? It's vibes, okay? If you're focusing too much on what the text is saying, or what the rules say, or political correctness, then you're focusing too much on the law and legalism and sort of the details, right? But the broad picture, the vibes, whatever I feel in my heart, that's not Pharisaic. That's Jesus' side. So whatever that target is, it's usually something that, it's just a way of saying that someone's opposed to what you're thinking, and there doesn't need to be much evidence there, because if you're pointing to specific sort of statutes or verses, then that puts you in the camp of quote unquote legalism, right? So that's when Pharisee kind of gets bandied about. But it's not unique to evangelicals. It happens there too. But if you go on Twitter, now known as X or Blue Sky, and you look for Pharisees, you're going to find a very extensive range of examples of people calling each other Pharisee, and they mean all sorts of different things. But mostly what they mean is, I don't agree with what you said.
Do Catholics, Protestants, priests, and politicians all use the term Pharisee for the same purpose?
Yes and no. The basic thing that's going on, right, is that Pharisee is used rhetorically in the Gospels as a way of creating this rhetorical wedge, right, between the Jews and this sort of nascent early Jesus movement. And that wedge gets kind of bigger and bigger, and the anti-Judaism gets bigger and bigger, right, until Pharisee stands in for something that is wrong and also opposed to the thing that I like, right? And in most cases, that it's Christians using it against other Christians, right? So if you're doing Christianity in a way that is wrong, that's when that gets used. And that can happen in all sorts of circles. It can happen with politicians. It can happen in Catholic contexts, in Protestant contexts, in secular contexts, right? Where it's just part of sort of the Christian background of modern secular culture, right, which is steeped in Christian ideas, whether people are aware of where they come from or not.
What do we know about the historical Pharisees, and how many sources do we currently have that tell us about them?
Yeah, I mean, the historical Pharisees, on the one hand, we know like an okay amount, but on the other hand, we'd like to know a lot more. And it's sometimes hard to determine whether a source is actually talking about Pharisees or not. But we've got a bunch of stuff from Josephus, who goes through all of these religious groups, right? He tells us about the Essenes, he tells us about the Sadducees, he tells us about the Pharisees and how they, agree with each other and disagree with each other. And then we also have, to the extent that we can take it as historical, we have some evidence from the Gospels and from Paul, right? So we know that the Pharisees attended synagogue because in the Gospels they kind of seem to be there when Jesus is there. And all of these things, right? We don't know for sure that these are historically 100% accurate, but they're at least accurate enough that an early reader or hearer of these texts would not be like, well, that's not right at all, right? Because they just sort of get accepted as, yes, that's how Pharisees, that's where you might expect to find a Pharisee, for example. We know that they anticipate some sort of resurrection after death. Okay, that comes from Josephus and from the Gospels and from Acts as well. So that's very similar to Jesus and Jesus's followers as well. We know that Pharisees wash before a meal. Now, there's disagreement about the way that you should wash before a meal, right? That's part of the debate that Jesus and the Pharisees are having. There's an expectation that a portion of your income would go to charity. Okay, so tithing. There's a concern with ritual purity, although again, the Pharisees and Jesus seem to disagree about certain very minute aspects of that ritual purity. Like Jesus, they also use the title rabbi or teacher. They agree with the greatest commandment, right? Love God. Okay. They live a frugal lifestyle. We know from Josephus that they have a lot of popular support, especially from women. Okay, so that comes from the Gospels as well as from Josephus. They are concerned with and interested in having debates about the right way to interpret Jewish law, as is Jesus, right? That's the whole point of their conversations, is that they're debating with each other, and they think it's important to do that. They respect, or they urge respect for elders. This is something that Jesus is a little iffy on. And they believe in divine judgment after death. So same like Jesus. And then there's a debate about divorce, right? That Jesus and they have. So they're on the side of you can have a divorce, and Jesus is a hardliner and says, no, you can't have any divorce at all. Right. So those are the kind of the general things that we know about the Pharisees. Josephus tends to focus on their distinction from the Sadducees. So the Pharisees imagine some sort of judgment after death, or reward or punishment, whereas the Sadducees think you're going to have, your fair dues are in this life, right? If you're a good person, you'll have wealth in this life, and if you're not a good person, well, that's why you're poor, basically. So we, Josephus, the Gospels, a little bit of other bits of the New Testament. There's a bit in the Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe, but we don't know. There's a discussion about these seekers of smooth things that are mentioned in one of the scrolls, but scholars aren't sure whether that's referring to the Pharisees. It just means a group that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever they were, didn't think they thought they were too soft, basically, and too easygoing with sort of Roman occupation and Roman attitudes and lifestyle. So not hardline enough. So I mean, that's something in common. It could be them, because Jesus also didn't think they were hardline enough. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it and what we know. But there's a great book that came out a couple of years ago that's specifically on the Pharisees. Amy Jo Levine was one of the authors of that. So that's a really great and exhaustive book as well.
How does the New Testament um, show the Pharisees at times trying to save Jesus? Let me rephrase. So, despite the fact the New Testament so often portrays the Pharisees as Jesus' enemies, it, it yet shows them trying to save his life.
Yeah, this
Can you
is
tell
such
us
a
a little bit about
strange one,
that?
isn't it? This is in there's a bit in Luke 13 where the Pharisees come up to Jesus and sort of warn him that Herod is trying to kill him, and they say you should go somewhere else. And this is, I mean, this is kind of curious, right? Because it shows that there's, even in the rhetorically charged gospels where there's this really concerted attempt to present the Pharisees as like the the foils to Jesus. um Even there's some ambivalence or ambiguity about the Pharisees and their relationship to Jesus. um and you know this is this is the kind of thing that all we see also in how similar Jesus and the Pharisees are in a lot of their views on Judaism. Um, so we can see that there is, you know, there's some overlap there, and maybe that overlap, sort of slips into solidarity at some points. It's a very strange thing otherwise to sort of include if you're trying to rhetorically present the Pharisees as sort of the big bads, other than the Romans. It's strange, isn't it, to have that mention in there that they're trying to save Jesus's life. I mean, we kind of see an interesting thing going on in John's gospel as well with this, where on the one hand, we have, John using the term the Jews to sort of rhetorically construct this other. But at the same time, in the Gospel of John, like Jesus's followers are Jews, and Jews are often represented like quite positively, as empathetic or as listening to Jesus, and so it's not as cut and dried as it's often represented, right? There is some, quite blurry. The lines are not as clear as later authors like Chrysostom, for example, would have us believe.
When Paul says he is a Pharisee, why does he bring it up?
Yeah, so Paul's an interesting case, right? And this is really complicated. This is one of the places where he is boasting, right? Paul is boasting about his his CV basically and his authority. So he's using this to bolster his the weight of his argument. Okay, he's not. This isn't something that he's embarrassed about, and this isn't presented as something that's, in the past for him. This is something that he owns as part of his present identity. So that's really interesting, right? And we can also see this in Paul's ideas, right? So resurrection of the dead and final judgment are also really important to Paul, just as they are for the Pharisees, right? As far as we know. So it's not super weird for Paul to align himself um, with the Pharisees and sort of brag about that, especially if we know from Josephus that the Pharisees were, really highly regarded by the vast majority of Jews in antiquity as being great authorities on the law. They had the best way of interpreting them. And we know this from Josephus, that especially women were super fond of the Pharisees and really paid attention to what they said. If we think about Paul's congregations or Paul's communities, we can imagine that there were probably lots of women in them. We've got Romans 16 that talks about lots of women in these groups. We've got lots of sort of artisans mentioned, right, who are sort of, as middle class gets back then. And it kind of makes sense that these people would be perhaps swayed by the idea that, Paul, being a Pharisee or aligning himself with Pharisaic interpretations of Torah, would justify however he's interpreting them now, right? Even if he is like writing to Gentiles, which we know that he is, not to Jewish communities.
Did Paul's views of did Paul's view of Jesus as a returning eschatological Messiah conflict with Pharisaism?
I don't think so. I mean, we don't, we don't have a lot of evidence about what Pharisees specifically had in terms of an idea of a particular Messiah, but there's nothing to my knowledge that would contradict that. Um, I mean, the idea of an eschatological, expectation that the Pharisees are waiting for God's judgment. Paul is waiting for God's judgment. Jesus is preaching the coming of God's judgment. All of those things fit very well together. And we have evidence of Pharisees, ending up following Jesus. In John 3 and Acts 15, we have examples of this, and Paul himself as a Pharisee ending up following Jesus. So it doesn't seem to have contradicted it, at least for the Pharisees that we know of in antiquity, right?
Was Jesus criticizing the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23, 2-3?
I mean, yeah, he is criticizing them, and this is one of the places where it's important to have that distinction between the rhetorical force of what the Gospels are doing and the historical reality, right? So, yes, rhetorically in Matthew, Jesus is absolutely criticizing some Pharisees for not doing, for not doing what they say that everyone else should do, right? So, this idea of negative depictions of Pharisees, but it also says that Jesus thinks that people should follow what the Pharisees actually say, right? So he agrees with their legal interpretation. He agrees with their interpretation of Torah. He thinks that people should follow what the Pharisees say you should do. He's just criticizing their own behavior. And this is something that is pretty common in other Jewish texts from the time period and from afterwards. So, there's lots of warnings in the Talmud about watching out for teachers who, say one thing and do another. Watching out for hypocrisy is something that's important in a range of Jewish texts from this time period. So in that sense, Jesus isn't really an outlier in that. Matthew's text is not an outlier in that. But it's really interesting that what often gets overlooked by interpreters of this text is that Jesus isn't saying the Pharisees are wrong, right? Their interpretation of this text is, or of the law in general, as far as Jesus is concerned here, is largely correct. So it's great if you want to follow that. What he's critical of is that they don't often follow it themselves, or they don't always follow it themselves.
Can you explain the possibility of reading Jesus' objections to the Pharisees in the context of his earlier diatribe against them in Matthew chapter 5?
Um, so let me just familiarize with myself with what's going on here. I mean, a lot of Jesus's diatribes, right? These are the woes to the Pharisees, the Beatitudes, these, problems with the law. The issue that Jesus has with the Pharisees is not broad strokes. It's not that the Pharisees are totally wrong. It's that they aren't exact enough. They aren't taking things far enough. So when we're looking at this commentary on hypocrisy and Jesus saying, do what the Pharisees say, but don't do what they do, that is part of his reading of the Pharisees as not being good enough followers of a law that Jesus himself finds very, very important, right? And so when we go into chapter 5, we get these contrasts, right, that Jesus is presenting between you've heard it said, but actually blah blah blah, and that's where we get this sort of constricting of the law. And this is a common Jewish practice of sort of it's putting a fence around the Torah. Okay, so you want to make sure that you don't step even close enough to accidentally, do something you're not supposed to do, and so you put a ring around it so that it's protected. So you can bump up against the fence and you're still going to be okay. And so that seems to be what's going on here. Is that, yes, we all know that there's these prohibitions on things like murder and adultery and things like that, and oaths, but Jesus is being overly or more cautious than the Pharisees about protecting that legal principle. And so Jesus's critique of the Pharisees is not that they are wrong in caring about these legal aspects. It's that he doesn't think that they're going far enough to protect them. And that may be where the accusation of hypocrisy is coming in, is that he sees that they say they're important, but they don't put in place these extra safeguarding measures to prevent accidentally going that far.
Is Paul portrayed in a similar way in Acts? Is there times where Paul appears to be opposed to the Pharisees, but in other times isn't, just like with Jesus?
I mean, Acts is such a strange depiction of Paul, in my opinion. I mean, one of the fun things about Paul in Acts is that he actually uses this known sort of animosity between the Sadducees, this disagreement about, theological disagreement between the Sadducees and the Pharisees to his advantage, right? So, he says, that he's a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and he's on trial concerning hope for the resurrection of the dead. So he really strongly allies himself with the Pharisees there because he knows that's going to start a fight, and he can kind of use that as a distraction to get himself out of hot water. So there's some interesting stuff going on with Paul and Phariseeism. Acts itself, right, is not the best, most reliable text to learn about the historical Paul, because it's got its own rhetorical aims that follows on from the Gospel of Luke. But when we read that in the context of Paul's own statements about his Phariseeism, it does make sense that Paul is proudly stating that, and is not just using it as an excuse to sort of get out of jail free, but that it's something that he holds true, right? That this is a known fact about Paul that the author of Acts is sort of using in a different context, which is something that the author of Luke Acts tends to do, is take things that are known and then sort of reconfigure them for his own purpose.
Are all the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, consistent in the way they portray Jesus and the Pharisees with this back and forth scenario of sometimes Jesus being in alignment with the Pharisees and other times not?
I mean, the Gospels are pretty varied. And some Gospels are, more confused about who the Pharisees are and sort of lump them in with the Sadducees as if they're the same, where like we know very well that they're not. That's part of how Paul is able to sort of exploit that division between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, knowing that they're going to get into a big fight over the resurrection of the dead. But all the Gospels, some more than others, are interested in giving Jesus sort of a foil, right? Of presenting him as able to hold his own with this respected group, and provide, interpretations of, the best way of being Jewish, that sort of is distinguishable from the Pharisees. But they all have their own, idiosyncrasies.
What conclusion do you draw based on this data regarding Jesus and the Pharisees?
I mean, I think probably, Jesus had a lot more in common theologically with the Pharisees than he did with, for example, the Sadducees. I think there's a lot of overlap there, and there's a reason why the Pharisees crop up more than other groups as Jesus's conversation partners. And it's because they probably have more interesting things to debate with each other, right? Like there's a lot of agreement on this eschatological idea of resurrection and of judgment. There's a lot of overlap in terms of how you should go about your daily life, how you should approach issues of ritual purity, issues of Sabbath observance, and their disagreements and their debates are about the ways to do that, and the best way to do that. So I think there's such a substantial amount of overlap, and I think it's really telling also that Jesus's arguably most famous follower, I suppose, Paul, is totally fine with calling himself a Pharisee, right? He sees that as not at all incompatible with being a follower of Jesus. So I don't know. We don't have any texts that call Jesus a Pharisee, but there is a lot of overlap there. We don't have any self-identification either, but he's not super far off. And Paul certainly doesn't seem to be taking pains to make that distinction as strong as the Gospels are, which are written a little bit later, obviously.
So I'd like to remind everybody real quick that the affiliate link is in the description below and in the pinned comment to purchase Judeophobia and the New Testament. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Meredith Warren.
Thanks for having me. It was great to chat with you again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.